thank you for your worship and song and encouraging each other in that way. Let's bow together in prayer as we look to worship in God's Word. Bow with me. Father in heaven, we come now to open your Word. It tells us that it is breathed from your heart. It has been revealed to your apostles and prophets over time. You have recorded it for us. You have preserved it that not one part will pass away until all is fulfilled. We come to worship in the book not because we worship the book, we worship you. And it reveals your heart. It tells us about you and how you've called us to live. So Lord, through your Spirit, speak to each of us. You know what each person needs, and so open the eyes of our heart that we might see and that we might respond. In your precious name I pray. Amen. Over the years of pastoring, and I've had a lot of people tell me why they aren't a part of a church. And I know you've heard some of the same things of why they've dropped out, used to be a part, and things like, people are hypocrites. The church is filled with a bunch of hypocrites, and I'm not going to go that, or they just want my money. That's, I go there, and that's just all they're concerned about is they want my money. Or perhaps, it's just a bunch of rules. They got all these rules that you have to follow. And I'm sure some of you have heard those things. In fact, some of you, maybe you're here this morning and you've been a little jaded by your experiences in church. I've learned a few things over the years that I don't try to argue with people that have been with that. I'm not going to argue about your experience, and if you're here this morning and you've been negatively impacted by a church, I've learned I try to have empathy. I feel for people that have been hurt. If you want to know how the church can hurt people, you and I can spend some time, and I can tell you lots of ways that you may not even realize, but I feel with you in your pain. There's an occasional time where, not too often, but I'll try to help them think about the inconsistency of their logic. I'm going to go to church because, they're just a bunch of hypocrites, or they didn't treat me right. And, do you walk everywhere and not drive a car because you got some bad gas at a gas station? So I'm not driving a car anymore. I'm just going to walk. I mean, you don't apply it that way. Or perhaps you got some bad food at a restaurant. So I don't eat out anymore. I don't eat out more because I had we somewhat selectively apply our logic. But I recognize the pain. I recognize the feelings that go on. But I also recognize that those are excuses. People use those excuses in the midst of pain to not push in deeper to the real spiritual things. What I have learned over the years when I hear those stories, those experiences, and in no way I'm minimizing any of them and not minimizing your story of hurt, it's a call to me. It's a renewal for me and the church to be what God intends it to be. I'm not going to argue with your experience. I'm not going to probably not even confront on, because many times people really don't want to hear, but what it does is it challenges me that by God's grace, it's a fresh call to be the pastor that he wants me to be, and that we as a church might be the church that he wants us to be. But I ask you the question this morning, how does the church start living the new humanity that we are intended to be? Yeah, I acknowledge that there's bad examples, the same as there's bad restaurants and bad food and bad gas. And yes, there's churches that are not healthy and not good. So the question is, how do we become the church that he intended us to be? Now, if you're looking for perfection on this side of heaven, I guarantee you're not going to find it with me, or you're not going to find it here. But that doesn't excuse or justify us coming short of being the people that God intended us to be. So take your Bible and turn with me to Ephesians chapter 4 if you're not already there. If you're with us today for the first time, or you haven't been with us over these few months, we've been working our way through the book of Ephesians, that letter that Paul sent to a group of churches. And I've entitled this series kind of Living Up to the Billing. Living up to what we're called and supposed to be. I'll remind you, those of you who have been with us, that the book of Ephesians, that it's pretty well consistent throughout the book that the pronouns are in the plural. If we were down south, it would be written as you all, y'all. It's written to a community. We have so much, in fact, this week and Lord willing next week, we're so tempted to think personally, and while it has personal relevance and personal application, it's written to the community, to this body, this group of people. It's talking about the community of God's people. It's talking about the church being the church. Lord willing, we'll see next week that the church needs to put off speaking falsehood and speak truth with one another. The church needs to start speaking as things as they really are. Not as you maybe want to hear them, not in what a way it itches or scratches your itch, gives you what you want, but as God really says it is. We'll get into that more next week. But I first want to challenge us from this passage that Melinda read, and I appreciate you reading it so well, that God's calling us to don't follow the crowd. Don't follow the crowd. And again, there's a personal application to it, but he's talking to the church. The church can't follow the crowd. The church was never intended to follow society. We'll get into this more, but more and more, the church is taking its cues from the culture. I mentioned to you a couple weeks ago that we recently went to church when we were spending a little bit of vacation, and they had black lights, and they were doing the lights coming in and out, and I was glowing under the black light. It's like, what's this about? If I read the Bible frontwards or backwards, where would I ever get that? We're taking our cues from a culture that we'll see in a little bit is very much misled. Don't follow the crowd. Look with me at verse 17 of chapter 4. So this I say, and I affirm together with the Lord, that you walk no longer just as the Gentiles. The ethnic groups. He's using here Gentiles as everything non-Jewish, all the other ethnic groups. We could maybe use the word world, but as everything else, or as the crowd. If you remember a couple weeks ago, I showed that in this section, it's all about our walk, how we're living out our life as a community. Look back at verse 1 of chapter 2. Walk in a manner worthy of the calling. Chapter 4, verse 1. This is about how we conduct ourselves as a community of faith. In verse 17, don't walk as the other ethnic groups do, because you're a new humanity. We saw that in chapter 2. In verse 22, he says, don't walk as the former manner of life, lay aside the old self. And if your translation has self, then the New American Standard, you might pencil in there, maybe even your margin, mine has humanity. There's an old humanity, an old humanness, and then there's this new humanity, chapter 2, verse 15. Don't follow the crowd. I'm going to put up Eugene Peterson's translation from the Message. I think he does this really well here. He says, and so I insist, and God backs me up on this, that there be no going along with the crowd, the empty-headed, mindless crowd. They've refused for so long to deal with God that they've lost touch not only with God, but with reality itself. They can't think straight anymore. Feeling no pain, they let themselves go in sexual obsession, addicted to every sort of perversion. I think Peterson he uses it in contemporary language and he puts it together. It's like, that's like watching the nightly news. What he's saying as a church, as a community, don't allow the thinking and conduct of the church to be just like every other human institution. It's a sad day when the church becomes just like any other organization. Because he says in verse 22, that is being corrupted. Look with me at verse 22. That in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted. It's an interesting phrase. It's the idea of shriveling up, wasting away, spoiling. I encourage all of you to go home after this message and service and pull out the crisper in the bottom of your refrigerator. And there in the back is that leftover apple or perhaps the green pepper that's all drying up and shriveling. Now you guys are looking at it like we're the only one that has that, okay? You're like, oh, no. Yeah, it's because you just cleaned it yesterday. It was Saturday, okay? But that piece that gets stuck back there and it just dries up and frizzles and it gets a spot on it and it's just away. And so with that, you throw it out. He says this is what is shriveling up, wasting away. It's depraved in a moral sense. It is corrupted. The societal psyche has become to a state where it's corrupted. It doesn't function. And so Paul is calling the church to don't follow the crowd. Don't take your path after society. Because he says in verse 17, and we're going to take a little bit of time to work through this, and I want to try to help you understand. I encourage you to hang with me. But verse 17, he says that you walk no longer just as the Gentiles or the ethnic groups also walk in the futility of their mind. Futility has the idea of being empty. That's where Peterson says empty-headed. It's worthless, it's purposeless, it's even absurd. In 2 Peter 2, verse 18, he uses this word to refer to false prophets who they boast and they brag, but their words are empty. They don't mean anything. And they're empty in their mind. Now, mind here is not their ability to pass an SAT test, or it's the mind of their moral disposition. They are empty in their moral disposition. The idea is that their thought processes have become to where they have no moral sense about them. They're void of what was intended. Now, hang with me. I've already mentioned that to you, but we're going to get, okay, let me give you examples of what we're meaning. And we're going to pick up this morning's paper. Their minds have become empty. They become worthless because, verse 18, they're darkened in their understanding. What they should be able to understand has become dark. That's used of an astronomical sense, like stars and the sun, and that's darkened, but here he's talking in a spiritual sense. Their understanding has become dark. It's like a light bulb, and when the light bulb gets burnt out and that filament that goes in there, and you look at it and say, is this bulb good? And it's broke. It doesn't connect. It's like, oh, this bulb's bad. Society's bulb has went bad. It's dark. It doesn't illuminate. The reasoning process is without illumination. They give the appearance that the lights are on, but they're not. Because, he goes on in the next phrase, that they are excluded from the life of God. They've been separated from the life of God. Peterson says they refused or longed to deal with God, that they've lost touch. You see, we don't want God, and this is not specifically about taking prayers out of the public schools or not allowing some of that, but that's a symptom of something in our society. That we've just become disconnected from the very person that gives us life. They are excluded from the life of God. The one who imparts life, the one who imparts light, the one who imparts energy, they've become separated. He goes on the next phrase that they're ignorant. You can look up on your own, but Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 23, Paul addresses this downward spiral in the same way, covering some of the same phrases. But he says, though professing themselves to be wise, they become fools. We don't need God. We know what's best for your family. Their foolish hearts have become darkened. He goes on the next phrase, in fact, there is now become a hardness of the heart. For so long it's been this way that now it's just become hardened. He goes on that it's callous. You see, some of you started doing yard work. I know you've been out and raking the leaves out of the flower beds and getting things cleaned up and ready for the spring. And all of a sudden, like, oh, I got a blister on my hand. Because like me, have become soft, right? You haven't been doing it for a while. But then after a while, you build up a callus, right? You kind of get enough wear, and pretty soon a callus forms. And you see, there used to be a softness, a sensitivity, but now it just becomes callous. Because there was a commitment or a devotion to sensuality and impurity. In fact, look at the end of verse 19. You can kind of trace it back up, and then we're going to make some application. Give me some examples, but look at the end of verse 19. In their greediness, they begin to practice every kind of impurity, giving themselves fully to sensuality, so that they become callous, then they become hard, then their mind has become worthless. Our society could never get enough. The sexual revolution of the 70s, those who you lived through that, the 60s and the 70s, wasn't enough. We got to get to more perversion. I'm going to talk about some things, and I encourage you to think about this, because we need to appreciate what Paul is saying and the context in which we are now living, the darkness and the emptiness and the twistedness of our culture. You know, there's other cultures across the centuries that have practiced things like child sacrifice. I mean, that's just a historical record. You know, they would take infants and they would throw them into the fire to a god so that they might have bountiful crops or whatever issues. And we look back and it's like, child sacrifice. Or cannibalism, okay? I spent some time decades ago in Fiji that was known for cannibalism. And so if they would eat their enemy, then they would gain their power and their strength of whatever they had. So cannibalism's like, I will gain this strength and eat them. So it wasn't because they were hungry. And we look at cannibalism, and that was part of that culture. We look at that and how horrendous. But let me ask you, how many of you thought 40, 50 years ago that we as a society would talk about gender transition and gender affirming surgery? That a little boy comes in and he says suddenly that, I'm a girl. I'm a girl. And so we would take and we would cut off body parts and begin to transition this young person so that they can become what they say they are. 40 years ago, would you ever even thought that would be? Or a little girl come and say, no, I'm a boy now. And so we would do surgery to construct and make things. Decades ago, we'd say, wait a second, your thinking's wrong. You're really mixed up. But now as a society, a culture, we affirm it. Now you say, Pastor Jeff, why are you going there? Because some of you, I'm making a little nervous that I'm even talking about it. Well, I don't know why he needed to go there, and I'm just glad he didn't say more. And why is he even, you see, we've even become influenced by it. That we're reluctant to call crazy crazy. We're hesitant to call, no, that's just empty-headed. That means your light bulb is burnt out. I can love you. And you know what? I will love you enough to speak the truth and help you. So are we one step away if some kid comes in and says, I'm a fish. So we're going to try to put him in water. I assure you none of the people being baptized today have said they're a fish, and I'm not going to try and make them swim, okay? You see, we used to think a little bit clearer, but we're in this downward spiral where we no longer think clearly, and we become calloused and hardened. And I do believe that it's affected the church. And I apologize or to a certain extent, some of you say, well, I don't normally come to church here. You're here as a guest, and I thank you. And it's like, I can't believe this guy is speaking like this, but I'm trying to speak truth in love. And Paul is saying, listen, if you as a church are going to go with the crowd and not call a spade, to use that old phrase, and speak the truth in love, if you don't speak it, nobody else is going to. Because they're burnt out. They've professed to be wise. I know they got some letters behind their name, and I know they wear a white coat. But it doesn't mean they're spiritual. That's going with the crowd. And Paul says, listen, if this community is going to be the community that I've called to be, a light in the midst of the darkness, a people that speak truth in love, then you have to put off going with the crowd. It's amazing how easily we can be manipulated and go with the crowd. I will confess this afternoon, or before I go to bed tonight, I have to follow up with a teacher. We're still connected, we're still friends, but I will ask their forgiveness and confess to them my wrong from back in high school. So some of you knew me back in high school, and thankfully most of you have forgotten stuff when I was back in high school. But we had this teacher, and it was in a business class, and he would stand out in the hall as all the kids would come in till the bell rang. But we would get in class, and we about every week would come up with some way in which we would see if we could lead him to where we wanted him to go. And so quite often, like one of the things we did was he had windows in his class, and so we said, okay, now let's different ones start looking out the window like there's something out there. And we'll see if we can get him to go look out the window. Now, so you can know why I didn't study hard enough and I didn't learn the things I did. But anyway, so one of the kids would sit over in the class, and so we'd kind of orchestrate, and they'd go like. And then a couple rows back, and the other kid would start going like. And then a little bit later, another kid would be looking over there. And so finally, after a while, he'd like, well, what am I missing, And so he'd get up and, what am I seeing that, or what am I not seeing? Another time we did was to look up at the ceiling, and then pretty soon another kid, we'd kind of wink and was like, look up at the ceiling. And pretty soon, so then next thing you know, he's going like, what are you guys? What? Another time we'd like, do you want me to answer the door? Do you want me to answer the door? It's like, well, no. Oh, well don't you hear? Do you want me? So he'd get up and go answer the door. I was like, nobody's out there. So he'd come back, and pretty soon a different kid was like, hey, I'll go get that. And he kept, we probably drove him crazy, okay? But it's amazing how you could just kind of manipulate him. See, you get a bunch of people working together. The next thing you know, they have them looking out the window or looking up at the ceiling or hearing things that aren't there. My point with that, and I will contact him today and say, I'm sorry. He taught for a few more years, and then he quit teaching, so now I know why. But in all seriousness, if you've been with us in Ephesians, we're in a spiritual battle. And C.S. Lewis, in his Screw Tape Letters, got it correct that there are a bunch of forces out there that are manipulating us. You see, they're leading us along, and they get the crowd to all of a sudden start looking up at something that's not there, or start reacting to something they think is there, and just leading the crowd down the primrose path. He said there used to be, and I want to continue to push in this just for just a moment. Hang with me. Maybe perhaps when you were a kid, you'd say to your parents and say, well, everybody's doing it, or everybody's going, everybody, we'd say that as peer pressure. And our parents, maybe yours came back and say, well, if everybody's jumping off a bridge, are you going to jump off a bridge? Well, no, because, but now, well, everybody else is. See, there's very few parents that are saying, well, I don't care what everybody else is doing. I've said many times that if you're parenting like everybody else, like the crowd, you're probably parenting wrong. Well, no, Pastor Jeff, you just don't understand. With sports today, if you're going to be involved in sports, that's just the way it is. I contend it's not. And maybe you need to get a different coach or a better coach. But I've known coaches on a collegiate level and a professional level that only ran their practices for an hour and a half. Not 2 hours, not 2.5 hours. That reflects on the coaching. There have been NCAA champion coaches that didn't go past an hour and a half. They scripted every minute. And some of their players say when I actually got to the game, it was a lot easier to play the game than to play my practice. Oh no, that's just the way it is. But we're talking about this community of faith. How does it creep into the church?
It creeps into our business meetings. Oh, we got to have business meetings. Why do you have to have business meetings? Now, things need to be done decently in order, but when did the church become a business? For a lot of years, I preferred to call them family meetings because the Bible talks about a family. Those of you who know me, basically know managing finances, I'm fairly diligent about that. So there's a wise management of things, but we're not a business. This is his family. We could get deeper into things, but how we elect individuals or appoint individuals, like, well, you got to have somebody win and somebody lose. I saw that go on for decades. So, I've lost 3 times. I'm not going to put my name up again because I can't compete against elder so-and-so. Where do we have to have somebody voted in and somebody not voted in? Well, yeah, that's the way the world runs it. We've got Robert's Rules of Order. That's what governs our Congress, is Robert's Rules of Order. I don't know if you know, in parliamentary procedure. Like, that's a real example to follow, right? Paul says, listen, you got to put off. Don't go with the crowd. But what he does say is go with Jesus. Go with Jesus, if I can phrase it that way. Look with me in verse 23. And that you be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and you put on the new self, or the new humanity in the likeness of God, which has been created in righteousness and holiness. Verse 20, but you did not learn Christ in this way. Listen, when Christ called you to follow him, he said, I will make you fishers of men. He didn't call you to make you some politician. The church has to begin to think in the mind of Christ. Verse 24, put on the new humanity in the likeness of God. This whole section in the following verses is going to be putting off. Stop doing that. I know that's the way most other people do it. And put on this. Lay aside the old self. There's no clearer illustration of that than what we're going to see in just a few moments, baptism. Buried in the likeness of his death, raised to walk in newness of life. In fact, we have records from the 2nd century that the early church began a custom. Some of you may come from contexts where they do this, to put on baptismal robes, oftentimes white. We just don't have that in our culture and tradition, but we have dating clear back to, I think, the 2nd century is the first, where they would take off the old clothes. That's the old dirty clothes. And they would put on a new cloth, a white cloth. They were applying this theology in an illustrative way. The old me has died. The new has come to walk with Christ. And Paul is saying that is the way the church needs to be. Take off, put away the way this mindless world is living as community, and you be a new community. A new community that walks in the footsteps of Christ. The church starts living who we are when we stop following the crowd and start walking with Jesus. We march to the beat of a different drum. I still have hope for the Church of Jesus Christ, that we can be a light in the midst of darkness. We can be a testimony to the entire universe that God has done something miraculous in his grace. But Paul says we have to put off, quit following the crowd, and start walking in the footsteps of Jesus. Bow with me in prayer. Lord, I thank you for your word, and I thank you for the conviction, the clarity, the straightforwardness of in love and care for a lost and dying world, but describing it as it really is. And Lord, I pray that my words and expressions will have taken in a way that comes from your heart. And Lord, I pray that we as Grace Bible Church might be different, might be an example, might be fleshing out the image of Jesus Christ. Forgive us for ways in which we've taken our cues from the world. And Lord, through your Spirit, help us to be more tuned in to your Son, that we might walk in the path that he set before us. Bless us now as we worship you through baptism. In your precious name I pray. Amen.
Would you stand?